This is Lesson 21-2, The Spread of Radical Ideas. What new ideologies emerged to challenge conservatism? College Board Topic 6.7 is called Ideologies of Change and Reform Movements. Explain how and why different intellectual developments challenged the political and social order from 1815 to 1914, that's period 3. The concert of Europe and the European conservatism. The liberals emphasized popular sovereignty, individual rights, and enlightened self-interest, but debated the extent to which all groups in society should actively participate in its governance. Radicals in Britain and Republicans on the continent demanded universal male suffrage and full citizenship without regard to wealth and property ownership. Some argued that such rights should be extended to women. Socialists called for the redistribution of society's resources and wealth and evolved from a utopian to a Marxist scientific critique of capitalism. Marx's scientific socialism provided a systematic critique of capitalism and a deterministic analysis of society and historical evolution. Anarchists asserted that all forms of governmental authority were unnecessary and should be overthrown and replaced with a society based on voluntary cooperation. The place is, of course, Europe from 1815 to 1850. Key concepts of the spread of radical ideas: liberalism, nationalism, socialism, Marxism, and laissez-faire. Key people of the spread of radical ideas: the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, Karl Marx, Adam Smith, and Friedrich Engels. So how did the basic political ideas that shape our Western society today get articulated? They didn't just happen by themselves. They didn't just get written in finished, perfectly developed form. These political ideas had to go through a long process of refinement and fine-tuning. It was these radical thinkers who were developing alternative ideologies to conservatism, refining them as they went, as they worked to appeal to new followers and gain momentum. Let's begin with liberalism. In 1815, it looked like liberalism, constitutionalism, and republicanism had been defeated. Congress of Vienna seemed to have put these dangerous ideas to rest. But the reality was that these ideas were here to stay. These ideas were just waiting for people and places to take them up again. Liberalism has two main components to it: liberty and equality. These had already been achieved in part. They were developing nicely in the U.S. Of course, we had the issue of slavery to contend with, but so did every other European country that had colonies, including Great Britain. France had a constitutional monarchy which Metternich was willing to live with, even though he didn't like constitutions. What are the nuts and bolts of liberalism in concrete terms? You can also call this the liberal program. Well, number one, you've got opposition to autocratic monarchy. We're just waiting for people and places to take up this fight again. Number two, equality before the law, not separate sets of laws that apply to separate classes, not privilege. The Enlightenment and the French Revolution had popularized and experimented with these ideas, but war and upheaval had produced an era of powerful pushback against these ideas. Number three, individual freedoms, specifically 5. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, and freedom from arbitrary arrest. In 1815, only Great Britain and France had any of these freedoms. And these freedoms were really just beginning to take shape even there. And the rest of Europe had not a single one of these rights and freedoms. So where did liberalism begin? You had the Enlightenment and you had the French Revolution in the 18th century. You also had a new growing middle class, and they were wealthy through industrialization and global commerce. And their doctrine of choice is usually coming from Adam Smith. Adam Smith, as we know, wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776, and he was actually arguing against mercantilism. Mercantilism was stifling and inefficient. It was not a good use of economic resources, especially human resources. Smith argued for free enterprise, free trade, free markets, free competition. equal opportunity to do what everyone does best, no regulation, no government interference, no unions. This system would create more wealth for everyone, in theory. You might say, this doesn't sound much like liberalism to me. And you're right, because there are two kinds of liberalism. You've got classical liberalism, and that's what we're talking about here in the 19th century. Liberate the economy, free competition, no regulations, no unions. Today you have modern liberalism, even out the wealth and power, more social programs, more regulations, and pro-union. Why does this growing middle class of industrialists support liberalism? It's profitable. We can do what we want with our businesses. Unions are outlawed. Instead, we call it the right to work. Unions restrict free competition. It also supports representative government, but only for the upper and middle class. There'd be a property requirement to be able to vote. The riffraff, they don't own enough property to vote. The logic behind a property requirement. How is it fair that someone who owns no property should be able to vote on what happens to mine? How is a voter with no property going to care enough to protect what's mine when he votes? The problem with liberalism for many people is this: voting rights don't go nearly far enough to satisfy a lot of people. This brings us to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says this: it is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people that is the measure of right and wrong. Utilitarianism comes from the Latin word utilis, which means useful. Under utilitarianism, good is whatever produces consequences that are beneficial. Nothing in utilitarianism is good in and of itself. The principle of utility says that people are governed by two things: pain and pleasure. People will act in order to get pleasure, and people will act in order to avoid pain. So these two things alone point out what we should do. These two things alone determine what we will do. But how do you measure pain and pleasure and happiness? Philosophers have applied utilitarianism to literally thousands of ethical issues in the last 2 centuries. Ethical issues such as reproductive rights, like abortion, etc., euthanasia, stem cell research, cloning, environmentalism, immigration, military action, whom to treat for the coronavirus. Modern utilitarianism was founded by Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832. He was a jurist. He had a law degree, but he never practiced law. He wrote extensively on how to apply the law in a utilitarian manner. He was also an economist and a social reformer. And social reform had been his passion since childhood. Jeremy Bentham was a committed atheist, and this drove many of his utilitarian and legal ideas. He rejected the Enlightenment ideas of, quote, natural laws and natural rights. You couldn't observe or measure such rights objectively. And he ridiculed the American Declaration of Independence. He argued that the principle of utility gives us an understanding of rights based upon concrete things, pleasure and pain. You can actually observe and measure and verify these things. Jeremy Bentham didn't believe that you could say that one type of pleasure was any better or worse than another type of pleasure. Instead, Bentham believed that you could measure the amount of pleasure that you were creating. Bentham invented all kinds of scientific tables for measuring amounts of pleasure. And he believed that laws, individual rights, public policy, and social reforms should all be measured and evaluated on the basis of how much pleasure they produced and how much pain they reduced. Using utilitarianism as his guide, Jeremy Bentham advocated for many individual rights and social reforms that were unconventional. Women's rights, including the right to divorce, vote, and hold public office. Prison reform, abolishing slavery and capital punishment and physical punishment. decriminalizing homosexuality. That idea was actually unpublished until the year 1931. Animal rights, freedom of expression, economic freedom. Then you have John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. He was a philosopher. He was a classical liberal. He was a member of Parliament. And Mill wrote 3 highly influential books. He wrote On Liberty in 1859, Utilitarianism in 1861, and The Subjection of Women in 1869. John Stuart Mill had been a student of Jeremy Bentham, but John Stuart Mill disagreed with Bentham's views about pleasure and pain, and he considered those views, quote, to have done and to be doing very serious evil. Mill's problem with Bentham was that Bentham's view of human nature left out the role of the human conscience as a motive for what people do. John Stuart Mill substituted the concept of happiness for pleasure. He believed some types of happiness were superior to others, and he believed that happiness could come from non-material things. John Stuart Mill wrote On Liberty in 1859. The individual is not answerable to the state about anything he decides to do, as long as it does not hurt someone else. To the extent that a person's individual decisions can hurt someone else, the state has a legitimate right to punish or constrain that person. This book, On Liberty, has continuously been in print since it was published. A new copy of the book is ceremoniously given to each new president of the Liberal Democratic political party in Britain. John Stuart Mill believed in utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says that actions are not right or wrong in themselves. Instead, our actions should be evaluated based on whether or not they do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. For example, murder. It's normally bad. But murdering Hitler could be thought of as good and upright if you looked at how many lives you'd be saving. In 1861, John Stuart Mill published 3 essays called Utilitarianism. And in this work, John Stuart Mill argued that the greatest utilitarian act you can achieve in all of society is to give all people their liberty. John Stuart Mill attempted to include the right for women to vote in the Reform Act of 1867, also known as the Representation of the People Act. And he pushed to have the word man changed to person, but Parliament wouldn't go for it. In 1869, he published The Subjection of Women. John Stuart Mill hated social privilege, and this went especially for gender privilege. He was a member of the Parliament at a time when his own wife, whom he considered his intellectual equal, couldn't vote. He viewed giving women equal rights as a utilitarian value because it would do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Moderate republicanism. Republicanism is a very broad term. It basically means anyone who does not believe in having a king. It seeks to abolish privileges based upon its opposites, monarchism and conservatism. Republicanism was inspired by 2 major influences. Number 1, memoirs of the Enlightenment thinkers, especially Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Montesquieu. And B, Jacksonian democracy. Republicanism says that kings, clergy, and nobility should not have special privileges. For example, even moderate Republicans favor public, tax-supported compulsory education. This takes the power over education away from monarchical conservative clergy. Public education is a critical tool for nation building of a new republic. Republicanism is against liberalism because liberalism advocates greater but still very limited voting rights based on property. Moderate republicanism advocates universal voting rights for all. And when we say all in the 19th century, we mean all males, unfortunately. Remember that when these 19th century movements talk about universal suffrage, it's just understood to mean universal male suffrage. Moderate republicanism stands for equality through democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville made this point in his book, Democracy in America. De Tocqueville was a member of the French Parliament under both the monarchy, 1839 to 1848, and under the Second Republic, 1849 to 1851. And we'll talk about both of these organizations soon. De Tocqueville considered himself to be a little left of center. Moderate Republicans had an I know what's mine mentality. They believe that government should protect their property. Moderate Republicans are against radical Republicans because radical Republicans, such as socialists and Marxists, advocate reorganizing work in order to support the working class. Moderate Republicans felt that universal male suffrage was enough of a concession to the working class. But the working class felt that the entire purpose of having the right to vote was to be empowered to change things with their vote. Moderate Republicanism could team up with liberalism if the enemy was the right enemy. For example, the landed aristocratic conservatives. Nationalism. Nationalism is not going away. It hasn't been institutionalized at this point. But the relationship between nationalism and liberalism is this. The love of individual freedom that liberalism has easily translates into the love of a free nation. Nationalism transcends class, and nationalism is more important than class. Nationalism is going to affect governments differently depending on the demographics of that country. If you have a hodgepodge of many ethnicities in your country, like, for example, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, nationalism can tear these countries apart. These nationalists want independence from the center. But if you have a homogeneous population, for example, Great Britain, France, Prussia, the German Confederation, and the Italian Peninsula, then nationalism is going to bring these countries together. These nationalists want to unify within the country. Factors that are promoting a sense of common culture and common language. Number one, the literacy rate going up. People are reading the same things. Number two, compulsory education is starting. Kids are learning from the same curriculum. And number three, conscription into the army is at a high rate. All these different soldiers are receiving the same training and instructions. And how about governments that have large bureaucracies that need lots of people from wherever they can be found, wherever they are in the country? And of course, you have industrialization and urbanization going on during this time. In addition to that, you've got the press, the mass media, expanding into all the different areas, printing the same things. And this is going to influence the standardization of the language. And of course, mass education is fostering linguistic conformity also. Who are these nationalists? Where are they coming from? How do we describe them? Well, they're educated, they're liberal, they're middle class, they're intellectual, and they have this belief that every nation has the right to exist. So what is nationhood anyway? We tend to think that nationhood is this ethnic and organic thing that evolves naturally. But nationhood is actually much more artificial than we think. Nationhood actually begins in the minds of those who want to promote it. Artificial devices for creating and promoting a sense of nationalism, things we're familiar with, symbols, ceremonies, Independence Days, parades. How about class-neutral traditions? In other words, traditions that every class, no matter what you are, takes part in. How about us versus them messages? These kind of messages promote a sense of national mission, and they also promote a sense of, dare I say it, national superiority. Socialism. Socialism can also be called radical republicanism. Republicanism is a much broader term than socialism, but it's more radical than, let's say, liberalism or nationalism. The socialist platform argues this, that wealth differences lead to social inequalities. Society needs to be more equal and to help the less fortunate. But instead of doing that, society has been splintered into isolated classes that barely know each other. Society faces a spiritual and moral crisis and crossroads. According to socialism, society is going to have to ask itself this question and make a choice. Are we going to go the way of social conflict and exploitation? Or are we going to go the way of community and cooperation? Socialism seeks to organize work in a way that supports the working class. What are the causes of socialism? The political revolution in France, socialism begins in France, industrialization in Britain, and laissez-faire economics, and the stress on the sanctity of property. Socialism says that there are two negative consequences to capitalism. Number one, selfishness, greed, and individualism. And number two, inequality. And for a socialist, the central issue is property, the root of all social ills. The goals of socialism: cooperation and community. Regulate all private property, particularly if it is a capital asset. In other words, if it can be used to employ people, produce something, and make money. There needs to be more ownership by the government, and there needs to be less ownership by private individuals. That doesn't mean total ownership by the government and absolutely no ownership by private individuals, just less of one, more of another. Economic planning must be by the community as a whole, and there needs to be greater social equality. The earliest socialists were the Utopian socialists. And these Utopian socialists had grand schemes to create these model societies. And this stuff is not easy. In fact, all of them failed. Let's start with Henri de Saint-Simon, French guy, 1760, 1825. And he was a proponent of this thing called positivism. Positivism says all authentic knowledge is, number one, scientific, and number two, verifiable. Society operates by a set of laws just like the physical world operates by a set of laws. And that's an Enlightenment thought, isn't it? And if you can identify these laws and how they operate, then you can use these laws to your advantage. He supported industrial development, and he said there were two kinds of people in this world. Number one, you had the doers. The doers are the productive people, the contributors to a society. Examples: scientists, engineers, industrialists. The other type of people were the parasites. This is an idle class that lives off of the doers. Some examples of parasites are the aristocracy, lawyers, the clergy. The doers needed to be able to plan the economy. The idle class just needs to get out of the way. The main purpose of any institution is to improve the life of the poor. And Saint-Simon tried to create a community based on these principles. Unfortunately, it failed. Another utopian socialist was Charles Fourier. He lived from 1772 to 1837. And he had an idea for a community that he called the phalanx. And it was a community that was scientifically planned to the last detail. It would be self-sufficient, and it consisted of exactly 1,620 people. Not 1,619, not 1,621, 1,620. All property in this community was owned by the community and used for the common good. Charles Fourier advocated the total emancipation of women. He viewed marriage as nothing more than institutionalized exploitation of women. He wanted marriage abolished and for people to practice free love. He also tried to put his ideas into practice and failed. Another utopian socialist was a person we've already heard of, and that was Robert Owen. He was the industrialist who had advocated for getting children out of the factory way back then, back when we talked about children working in the factory. And he had an idea for an agricultural-industrial combo community. And he also tried to put his ideas into practice and failed. But the most important thing about all of these failed utopian socialists is this: they're going to inspire future reformers and revolutionaries. Below, you've got a rendition of Robert Owen's plan for a utopian community that he was going to call New Harmony. Flora Tristan, a proto-feminist who lived from 1803 to 1844. She was a student of utopian socialism, particularly Charles Fourier and Henri de Saint-Simon, and this puts her in the utopian socialist category. Flora Tristan actually came from a wealthy, powerful family in Peru. Her dad was Spanish, her mom was French. She was married and she had 4 kids, and in fact, the artist Paul Gauguin was her grandson. And she traveled around France and England preaching that the pathway to workers' liberation was through women's liberation. And our textbook does not even mention her name. In 1843, Flora Tristan published a book called The Workers' Union. And in this work, she argued that women's rights were directly related to the progress of the entire working class. Flora Tristan commented in this book that the working class in France hadn't really gotten anywhere in the previous 25 years. Hence, a powerful workers' union needed to be formed. She argued that union makes power, and she also argued that union dues could be used to finance health care and education for workers. Flora Tristan had a very interesting view of how to help the working class. She saw the working class as fractured, and the social fissures that fractured it could only be repaired by women's rights. Women's rights was the key to the unification of all the workers. Tristan had a utilitarian view. Women's liberation did the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, both men and women. For Flora Tristan, workers' rights began in the home. To her, the wife was the oppressed proletariat man's oppressed proletariat. Having a proletariat of your own in your home makes you more willing to be the proletariat of the manufacturers, financiers, and nobility. Flora Tristan sold her ideas as being beneficial to both males and females. She knew that the idea that women deserved equality just because they were human beings would not find much appeal to the average 19th century Frenchman. She was the first to connect the social rights movement with women's liberation, and in doing this, Flora Tristan laid the groundwork for feminism. Unfortunately, she died of typhoid in 1844. Anarchism. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who lived from 1809 to 1865, distrusted all authority and all political systems. He argued for the total abolishment of the state. He argued that people should just be organized into loose associations instead of nations or states or anything like that. Proudhon wrote, "What is property?" And in that work, he wrote this, that workers were the source of all wealth, and that profit was actually stolen from the workers. Does that sound familiar? That's going to be big later. Louis Blanc, who lived from 1811 to 1882. Louis Blanc advocated for the right to work as a natural right. You know, we've been talking about natural rights ever since the Enlightenment, right? Ever since John Locke and people like that. The right to religion, the right to free speech, the right to assemble, the right to life and liberty and property, the right to equality, the right to subsistence, the right to an education. And now here's Louis Blanc adding another right, and that's the right to work as a natural right. And he wrote a book called The Organization of Work in 1839. And in this, he said that workers need to win universal voting rights. Then they will be able to take over politically, and then they are going to be able to get workshops and factories publicly funded. The impact of socialism. Socialism began in France, and then it spread. It produced violent opposition to laissez-faire policies because these policies denied workers the right to organize. Workers also developed a new sense of class, and they favored collective action, and they favored government economic intervention on their behalf. Marxism. Karl Marx lived from 1818 to 1883, and he was originally Prussian. He had a PhD in philosophy, and he eventually settled in London, England. Marx synthesized sociology, philosophy, economics, and history, kind of really in a similar way to the way that Newton synthesized the sciences in his work Principia, when he synthesized people like Kepler and Brahe and Copernicus and Galileo. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels in 1848, and he also wrote Das Kapital, Capital, in 1867. Marxist theory. In Marx's world, all of human history was really just the story of class struggle. The vast majority of industrial workers are what he called the proletariat. The proletariat, they produce all the value in a modern capitalist economy. They get paid less than the value of what they produce. And the difference between the value of what they produce and the value of what they are paid is what he called surplus value. The tiny minority of capitalists are called the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie exploit their workers, and they pocket that surplus value that's produced by their workers. Karl Marx argued that the current time, his time, was a time of unprecedented exploitation. The proletariat was getting larger because of that exploitation, and the proletariat was getting poorer because of that exploitation, and the proletariat's sense of class consciousness was increasing. And Karl Marx predicted that all of this would only be changed by violent revolution. It's got to be revolution, and it's got to be violent. And when it's all over, society will be changed forever, and the proletariat will have overthrown the bourgeoisie. And in this new world, the workers will establish a society of perfect harmony and equality. Everything will be owned in common. There will be no private property, but that's okay. You won't miss your property because there will be no scarcity, and there will be no social classes. Cooperation will replace competition. Everybody's needs will be met. There will be no economy because there's no scarcity. And this social system would be called communism. And Marx himself was looking forward to witnessing the violence. And we will actually have much more on Karl Marx in a later unit.